So for my second presentation, I'm going to be looking at how humpback whale migration seems to be unchanged despite constantly changing oceanographic conditions. So the study I looked at is called Multi-Decadal Humpback Whale Migratory Route Fidelity despite oceanographic and geomagnetic change. The thing that's really interesting about this, well, first the goals, but investigate how humpback whale migration is impacted by oceanographic and geomagnetic variations in their path and examine the possible impact of G-space on whale migration. We'll get into what that means later. I think that's really interesting about this study is that usually in science we have this assumption that environmental change causes a biological response, and there are plenty of examples of this, including my last presentation. And there are also examples specific to humpback whales where this is true, in the North Atlantic and off the coast of California. But what we're going to find is interesting about this study is that we seem to not see the same thing when it comes to migration of humpback whales. So the methods of this paper, they used two different data sets to look at migration paths of humpback whales in the South Atlantic Ocean. So one was a historic Soviet whaling record from 1965 to 1973. So it logged the locations of 243 kills. Kind of sad, but also really good data about where those whales were during that time. And then the second data set is remote sensing data. So they use satellites to track the locations of 20 whales from 2003 to 2018. Sorry, I added an extra zero there. Anyways, so they both focus on generally the same area, but the second data set also includes a lot of information about magnetic field parameters, surface temperature, current data, as well as gravitational acceleration and bedrock data. So when we talk about movement parameters or even monitoring the movement of the whales, what we're really talking about are their use of migratory corridors, the direction, timing, velocity, and straightness of their path. So some other methods they used to monitor those variables that are interesting, again, those ocean currents, sea surface temperatures, and also the chlorophyll A concentrations, which is a good stand-in for productivity. They use satellite monitor to look at chlorophyll A concentrations from space and also to monitor currents and temperatures from space, which is pretty cool. And this is all a really good example of how all the oceanographic data that we look at in GeoMap app and on the NOAA site are being used in lots of different fields. So some of their results, the first thing that's really important to note is that all those oceanographic variables we were looking at were highly variable during the 2013 to 2018 collection period. So this figure on the right is really complicated, but I kind of broke it down on the left by color coordinating it. So the first thing is that magnetic field, which we think could be cues for migration, that changed dramatically. Next down, sea surface temperature also varied greatly from 18.8 to 20.3 degrees Celsius. Current direction also highly variable, as well as productivity. And productivity, they measured that by the metastrophic area. So yeah, big takeaway is just that all those things that we thought might be important clues or things that might impact migration varied greatly throughout the monitoring period. But despite all that variation, you can see by this figure on the right, these are dots with so the first one is the historic data set, and all those white kind of crosses and the orange crosses at the bottom, they show the locations of those kills. And then the next two are the remote sensing from 2003 to 2009, and then 2010 to 2017. And you can see despite the variables that we talked about on the last slide changing, there's an incredible amount of route fidelity. So that is the commitment to a very narrow corridor for this migration. And this is, again, over 50 years of data. And this migratory corridor is about 1 million square kilometers. And the other thing that's really amazing is those movement parameters that we talked about, the speed, velocity, straightness, and timing and direction. Those things were also incredibly consistent, despite all those variables we talked about changing so much. Some other results they found are that whales can be categorized into slow and fast moving groups, which is kind of interesting. You can see this was figure 3. It's kind of like bimodal distribution of the velocities of the whales, which is really interesting because if you organize the data by those fast and slow groups. And then you also look at it in terms of normalized gravity. You get this highly reproducible trajectory through these gravitational coordinates, which sounds really complicated, and it is really complicated. I don't totally understand all of it, but basically what this figure is trying to show us is that there are these really clear pathways divided into two groups. If we put them all together, we wouldn't really see it, but if you separate the slow and the fast moving groups, you get these really clear pathways through these gravitational coordinates, which is quite interesting. So current research, or research before this paper, really assumed that magnetism, gravity, and oceanographic features could be the cues that the whales are using for migration. Yet, as we saw, each of these have changed dramatically over the time periods covered by the data sets, but the migrations stayed pretty constant. So this study introduces the possibility of G-space, which are those gravitational coordinates, possibly being important navigational clues. So this study was nicknamed Fidelity Trumps Change. And I really like this quote because it kind of gets to the heart of the results that movement parameters have not significantly changed during a period of dynamic oceanographic and geomagnetic conditions, which really just makes you wonder what the relationship really is between the changing oceans and the inhabitants that are using the ocean to navigate. I think this whole example is really interesting because we know so little about how the ocean works, how geochemistry and currents and upwelling, obviously we've learned a lot in this class, but there are so many questions and so much more research to be done. We seem to know even less about how these conditions impact and interact with marine life, which I think is really interesting. It's also really cool that this study kind of pokes holes in the major theories about whale migration. The route fidelity over the 23 specific years, but spans over 50 years, withstand considerable changes to geomagnetism and all these other things. So it's clear there's a lot more going on that we can't see. So just to quickly summarize the results of the study again, in the face of highly variable oceanographic conditions, the migrations over 50 years demonstrate commitment to a very narrow, heavily trafficked migratory corridor that again was just 1 square kilometer, or 1 kilometer square, 1 million kilometers squared, sorry. And that goes from these calving grounds to the feeding grounds in the South Georgia Basin. And also that if you separate the whales into slow and fast moving groups, there's a clear pattern of movement through gravitational coordinates, which could be kind of the key, but I guess further study must be done.